We are continuing on our journey through the decades as we celebrate 100 years of Humble ISD. Let's take a look at the 1970s. In the 1970s, social progressive values that began in the 60s, such as increasing political awareness and political and economic liberty of women, continued to grow. The hippie culture began to die down by the early 70s and faded towards the mid-70s, which involved the end of the Vietnam War, opposition to nuclear weapons, the advocacy of world peace, and hostility to the authority of government and big business. The environmentalist movement began to increase dramatically during this period. But enough of that. Let's take a look at some of the major events and how Humble ISD was growing during the 1970s. The cost of living in the 1970s doubled between 1970 and 1979. In 1970, a new house cost $23,400, and in 1979, houses were $58,500. A new car in 1970 was $3,900 and soared to $5,770 by 1979. A movie ticket in 1970 was $1.50, and by 1979, a movie ticket was $2.47. A gallon of gas went from 36 cents in 1970 to a whopping 86 cents in 1979. Humble ISD was growing like crazy in the 70s too. In 1970, there were 5 campuses, and 7 more were added by 1979. District enrollment grew from 2,592 students to 10,242 students by the end of the decade. Gladys James became the first African American teacher to work in Humble ISD since 1947. She moved to Kingwood when her husband began work at Continental Airlines in 1971. She started at Humble Elementary School on January 3, 1972, and stayed at that school for 30 years. In April 1972, Louise Panzarella began her service as president of the Humble ISD School Board. She was the first woman to serve in that capacity. In 1974, the old Charles Bender High School building on Higgins Street was renovated to serve as the new district administration building. It served as the administration building for the next 18 years. Now let's take a look at some of the major events of the 1970s. In 1970, the first jumbo jet, a Boeing 747, made its first trip from New York to London in flight. In 1971, the U.S. voting age was lowered from 21 to 18 years old, which was the 26th Amendment. Also in 1971, the Walt Disney World Resort was opened in Orlando, Florida. In 1972, Pong, the first video game to have commercial success, was released. In 1975, Bill Gates and Paul Allen created Microsoft. And following right behind in 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak created the Apple Computer Company. In 1976, NASA introduced the first space shuttle, the Enterprise. In 1979, the 3 Mile nuclear incident occurred in Pennsylvania. And closing out 1979, the Walkman was introduced by Sony. The 1970s were all about political unrest, ending war, protests that gave way to peace, and transition to fun and funky. From the groovy hairdos to the bell-bottom jeans, the 1970s was a period of growth and discovery.